Tyler, what has the feedback been on the piece that you did, I believe, for The Atlantic about white people, or especially about the past 3 years, being very careful to acknowledge to us that they understand what a tragedy it is for us every day to walk around as Black people, and that it kind of gets on your nerves because people often call me brave. Not you were brave to write that piece, because I'm sure a lot of white people really wouldn't know what to do with it. And my sense of things is that a lot of Black people do wish to be treated that way, that they like the idea of somebody thinking that we spend our lives walking around being assaulted in various ways. Have you heard from anybody who has said that you're a little too ahead of the curve, or that you're being heartless, or that you're letting white people slide back to the way they were? Because I feel exactly like you. I am nauseated when somebody does that acknowledgement of the burden of my upper middle class, frankly, successful Blackness. Where racism affects me, it's probably 1.5 times a year and has nothing to do with the consciousness of any remotely consciously healthy person. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I get the feeling that's roughly your life too. What's the feedback?
No one has been critical. I'm sure it upset some people. I don't think they've yet figured out what to say about it, even if it's sort of in an emotional way upsets them. I've gotten no negative feedback. I've heard from a lot of people positively. The closest I've gotten to negative feedback has been people writing or people I've talked to that have said, okay, you don't want me to bring up race all the time, but then sometimes people do want to talk about race, and some of my Black friends want to talk about it a lot, and other of my Black friends don't seem to, so what do I do? And my response is, you got to treat them like people. And so much, I think the anxiety around interracial social etiquette is that white people feel a profound and overwhelming guilt and sense of powerlessness, but also complicity at what they see as American history and ongoing problems around police brutality or whatever. And they just want someone to tell them what to do. They want a fixed set of rules so that they can do the thing they're supposed to do to make them not racist. I'm often reminded, I'm a big fan of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, and he has this great line where he says, neurosis has the structure of a question, which sounds like a bit of academese, but what he means is that people who are neurotic experience their whole world as anxiety about who they are, what is their place within society and within the social order, what do authorities want from me, what does my boss want from me, what am I supposed to do? And they're constantly anxious about who they are and what to do. And here comes anti-racism and DEI and says, here's a fixed set of rules you can follow that will mean you're not racist, and that will also signal to everyone else you're not racist. The main pushback I've gotten has been like, well, some Black people do want me to talk about race, other people don't. How am I supposed to know? And I think that expresses this anxiety about an absence of rules, right? If we pulled back from this particular kind of interpersonal anti-racism, people would have to exercise judgment about, and take cues from Black folks about when they do and do not want to talk about race, and the point I've made is sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, and I'll let you know when I do, I think that makes people deeply uncomfortable because they would have to exercise judgment, and they just...
You realize that it's harder for the white person here than it is for us in any way, because there's a kind of Black person who is upset if you are not acknowledging race all the time. It is their entire consciousness. I hate to say, you might want to call it that they're living amidst Lacan's sense of what neurosis is. I hate to say it. But then there's a kind of Black person who really, frankly, doesn't want to hear it except under extraordinary conditions. And that's certainly me. Then there are people who are in between. And the white person has to also decide, do they believe this? Because a lot of them really don't believe in all of this oversensitivity. Then some of them very much believe in it. And then they would have to put up with somebody like me. I think most of them know to an extent that a lot of the exaggerated version of this is an act. But is it part of being a civilized white person to pretend? And is that what we're telling them to do? Pretend to believe something that you know is to an extent a kind of performance art. That's tough. It was easier 50 years ago for all of us in a way. I would not want to go back there, but that's tough. That's really tough.
I think I'm a little less cynical than you in the sense that I at least I know a lot of really true believers, right? Like white folks who really believe the whole, the whole anti-racism sort of etiquette. They're not acting, no. And then there's like another kind of person too who knows that you have to go through a certain, the motions in order to be, accepted the right way in whatever workplace, institution, wherever you're enmeshed in. But in my experience, and yours or other people's might be different. In my experience, I mostly encounter true believers who really feel guilty as white people and who desperately want to feel less guilty. And so they're just clawing and scraping for anything, someone to tell them what to do, right? To issue a demand and say, just do this, and then everything will be fine. So I think some people are cynical and have learned the rules and know all the jargon and lets them get by in their workplace and in their performance reviews or whatever. But mostly I experience people who really believe, and that might be symptomatic of the social circles in which I travel. But, I encounter more true believers than cynics, I'd say.
Okay, I have a question. The editors at The Atlantic titled your piece, I'm a Black professor, but you don't need to mention it. Something like that.
Yeah.
And you go...
Not my title.
Yeah, I assume not. But it's clever.
I think that's an AI-generated one.
You draw a distinction between a color blindness in policy and a color blindness in social intercourse as goals that one might put forward as ideals. You reject the former. Color blindness in policy is not what you're talking about, and you hope to buy yourself a hearing from your progressive audience as you advocate for it seems to me, for the latter, a de-emphasis on color in our informal social relations. And my question is, can you really have it both ways? Aren't those things symbiotically intertwined with one another? If we do policy in terms of race, don't we perforce invite personal relations in terms of race? That's my question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. The argument against colorblindness in law and policy is very different than the argument against colorblindness as an interpersonal ethos. I think they're entwined, and I think there's ways in which they feed back to one another, Glenn. I don't deny that, but I think they rest on fundamentally separate arguments, right? I mean, the first is a political argument about the way in which that certain kinds of race-neutral laws, going back to even the Homestead Act, but also the Fair Housing Act, the GI Bill, whatever, might officially be race-neutral, but then in practice tended to have racialized impacts that were differential. That's a very different argument, saying that race consciousness in law is sometimes anything but. That's a really different argument from saying that, interpersonally between two friends or two colleagues around the water cooler, it's racist not to acknowledge racial difference, right? And that professing not to see color is a dog whistle. On this last point, Coleman Hughes has been really good, where he, points out that there's this kind of case of terminal literalism a lot of people get, where they're like, obviously you see color, you have two eyes in your head, we can see race, the brain picks up race within milliseconds or whatever. And that's not what anyone means when they say I don't see color. They mean I try to treat everyone the same. And there's a big difference to me between pointing out that the law often doesn't treat everyone the same, and institutions like banks or police departments often don't treat everyone the same, despite the rhetoric of race neutrality. There's a huge difference from that in saying that we shouldn't aspire to treat everyone the same in our interpersonal reactions. So I don't deny that there's ways in which, particularly in workplaces, I think, where that can be a really difficult line to straddle. But nonetheless, I think we used to straddle it a lot more than we do now. My race comes up infinitely more post George Floyd than it did pre George Floyd when I talk to progressives, and those same progressives back then would have critiqued colorblind law and policy. So obviously there's been this sort of metastasis of critiques of colorblindness that's gone from just this political claim about the way that certain race neutral laws aren't race neutral toward colorblindness as such is bad. And it's this slippage from politics to sort of social psychology that I find both bizarre and a kind of mismatch. I don't think those two claims have much to do with one another.